appreciated. And we're live. It is Wednesday, May 12th, 5:04 p.m. Eastern Time, 2:04 p.m. Pacific Time, where Orin is. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Orin Kerr, law professor at Berkeley Law School, Bold School of Law, dressed as a judge in his regalia. So, boom, boom.
Why are you dressed as a judge, Orin Kerr?
Well, because this is in honor of the Facebook Supreme Court. I'm a Supreme Court too, so I'm not going to let them be the Supreme Court.
Because just anybody can now declare themselves as having a Supreme Court.
Exactly. We're all judges now.
So we're all judges now.
So what are you the Supreme Court of?
Could really be anything. That's the
sort of the Supreme Court of Orin Kerr.
I'm the Chief Justice of my Twitter feed. So if there are any questions of who to block or follow or retweet,
what is your jurisdiction in that capacity?
I have general jurisdiction and I have full authority to make rulings, very judicial rulings on these.
Does anybody refer questions to you, like Facebook refers questions to its Supreme Court?
We're still in the beginning of figuring this out. So we haven't formalized the procedures yet.
Yeah, just go easy on them, Ben.
No. So I'm really enjoying this spoiling for a fight because, on the one hand, Kate is the probably most prominent advocate for the idea that we should take this experiment seriously as an experiment, and you're, shall we say, not persuaded by that.
Yeah, I'm on the other side, and I should say, Kate's stuff is really awesome, and I love. It's incredibly interesting.
Oh no, I don't take it personally. I think that my stuff is fine.
So Orin, why shouldn't we take it seriously?
Because they're playing dress up. They're pretending. They're taking on some of the sort of feel of as if they were judges in order to seem very judicial, in order to make us like a commercial product better that is being sold by the company. And that's great. It's a company and they can sell their commercial products. And it's a very important commercial product. It plays a big role. But ultimately, strikes me as it's a business decision to create a model that they feel for business reasons they need to follow. And what I find kind of amusing about it is this sort of let us infuse it with real power, sort of like appearances, or like the sort of the way that the opinion was written, like a judicial opinion. We remand, we do that. That's all. Come on, it just struck me as, that was kind of.
No, I think that that's a completely reasonable reaction from a layperson.
Notice what she did there.
I'm gonna put my work back on, and you're gonna have a totally different impression.
So from a really fundamental standpoint, I actually think that at the very formative, I think our threshold issue to talk about is this public-private space. I think that you're assuming that just because it is a private company that is privately held, or it's publicly held, you know what I mean? It's a publicly held corporation, but it does have it's mostly private in that it is at the whim of Mark Zuckerberg for a lot of it, and that it has shareholders that it has to be accountable to and whatever else. But I would actually argue that is why that the transnational nature of Facebook and people's reliance on it for a public right of speech, and not just cat videos and not just very lighthearted stuff, but very real transmission of information, makes it a very serious space that bridges a public and private gap. And in the space of the rest of the world trying to figure out what Facebook is and how to understand it, in that technological gap, a technologically created gap, that there has basically been an assumption that because it's the private space has created this public-private space, that they can control it, and that this is a moment of trying to claim back some of the control and to institute a system of like rule of law and procedure around public rights, like freedom of expression, that are on a private platform. It is like, we could actually make a public accommodations analogy, but I don't want to get into like what everything that would entail in terms of like discrimination law and First Amendment law. But I do think that there is something I think that you have to kind of, if you're not willing to get to a level in which you're understanding that this is a public-private space, I think that we'll probably not be able to have a conversation. But like, that's kind of, I think, mostly what I'm trying to get at when I think about this stuff.
And maybe it just depends on what a public-private space is. I mean, it strikes me as a good starting point to say that most things that matter in life are private, right? Like the government does a lot of things, but the government is not the most important thing in life. And so when we talk about like a private company hosting public speech, we can certainly talk about it, the private company hosting like important speech and speech that matters to us as a community. And I completely agree with that. And I guess I don't know whether public-private speech means like government-infused private speech, or that just means sort of publicly important private speech.
But I guess I'm hung up on a different point, which is whether your objection to the oversight board is to the idea that it's adjudicating stuff, or to the pretentiousness of it. Because if Facebook simply said we're creating an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, our policy is we're going to refer all of these to something we're going to call the oversight board, in parentheses, alternative dispute resolution mechanism. Nobody would bat an eye. And by the way, they wrote into their terms of service, any disputes you have with Facebook over content will be resolved. You agree as part of your click-through will be resolved by Facebook's ADR mechanism. I don't think anybody would think of it as especially novel, or even like it might be thought of as an interesting use of ADR, but I'm not sure it's... I wonder if half of what is fascinating about the oversight board, both in the attract Kate to it as a matter for study, but also attract people's contempt and sneering, is that they asked Mike McConnell and Jamal Green and, the former Prime Minister of Denmark to be their like ALJ types but like, why is this different from any other private adjudicatory mechanism?
Yeah, I think the pretensions are a big part of it. And it's not just the people that they asked to be on it and kind of how they wrote the opinion, but it's sort of the idea that this is like the Facebook Supreme Court, or
they signed the charter with quill pens, which I do think is awesome.
And Kate, I was looking at your New Yorker article, which was great, and it interviewed Noah Feldman, and it was real courts could rely on this. It's like a quasi judicial body, and it's like no, it's not. There's nothing. I mean, just like I put on that robe and I became a judicial body too. And if courts want to cite what I said in the lieu of fun, they can do that. But that doesn't make me a judge. It just makes me some guy who is wearing a robe. And so there's sort of that sort of, but the pretension of it, I think, is a big part of it. And it's sort of the sense of this is not just we've got a bunch of editorial decisions to make, and we want it to be like a fair way of doing it to help sell the product. That is what is sort of, I think, what's actually going on. But it's sort of the dressing it up as something else, which I just find like it's a little bit much for me.
Sure, and I can totally see that. I think that the thing that I find interesting and draws me into this is that there have been all of these human rights issues around the takedown or leave up of various speech that Facebook has been making by itself in Menlo Park with no transparency, completely opaquely, and without a lot of like realization from the rest of the world outside of things like Donald Trump. In fact, many things outside of Donald Trump, millions that affect people's everyday lives, and that there's no way to have any type of redress for this. There's no procedure, and that effectively, without meaning to, they've created a commercial product for speech that like is also about the substance of speech, not just about like it's not like a Ma Bell type of issue. It's about like the actual substantive nature of the speech. People want them to both take down certain types of information with good reason and keep up different types of information for a good reason. And some of that goes against governments, and some of that aligns with governments, and some of it they just said in Turkey, for instance, that they're going to keep up like all of the speech that they like, just they're otherwise would have maybe taken down. There's all of these issues, and there's been absolutely no, and like, yes, it's just a commercial entity. They can do whatever they want. But at this point, they do have so much power that like, how are they like, there's no one government that could cut them off. They could cut them off in their country, but they can't cut them off everywhere. And I just kind of, I guess for me, the oversight board feels like to me, why not? Like courts are to some extent, and like you mockingly put on the robes, but like courts are and were in like for the UN tribunals and for most recent memory, but also for the Supreme Court when it was getting set up in the United States, things that people they had no legitimacy. They had no kind of like, they were just people, right? And they had no kind of ways of carrying themselves. They didn't have robes even necessarily. There were all of these things. And so
without robes, there was a nakedness problem.
Exactly. But I really do think that there is kind of this, I guess for me, that I look at like the people who use Facebook, of which there are 4 billion in the world. And I think that even if you have a small valence of people chipping away at this problem, that's great. And like the more that they act like a serious body, even though it's an act to gain legitimacy, the better. Like, what is legitimacy? I've actually spent like probably way too much time thinking about this when I was writing the YLJ piece. And I think like at one point, Julie Cohen was like, yeah, you should not use legitimacy theory here. Like, you should not look at this from a legitimacy standpoint. And like, I think she was right. But now I also think that like, there are some real questions, like what is legitimate? What isn't? Like, why is it when you put on the robe, someone would take you seriously if you walked into...
Well, Orin put on the robe and nobody took it seriously.
No,
but it's actually a really interesting question. What's the difference between what Orin did and what the oversight board people did? Well, like context is part of it. I think the fact that Orin was joking is part of it.
It is funny, though. When I was a law clerk, I remember thinking it was odd when like judges or justices would go into public and sometimes they would wear their robes, which they only wear in the courtroom, right? It's not like a judge walks around in chambers with robes on. And it's hilarious. It's like, why are they wearing a robe? Are they going to like rule? They're like talking to a bunch of high school students. They're gonna like, bang the gavel and be like, I overrule you. Like, what does that even mean? So I get, there's sort of the atmosphere of sort of formal power and all that kind of stuff. But I think of what Facebook is trying to do, I think, and Kate, obviously correct me if you disagree with this. I think what they're trying to do is make Facebook seem like a platform which is fair and therefore should be used, first of all, and then also not regulated out of existence or they're ultimately, this goes back to the selling a product idea. Whereas with judicial robes, with like, the U.S. Supreme Court, when it's getting started or something, that's like, we want you to recognize that we have this formal government power and we're legitimate in the sense of the consent of the governed, and you should recognize us when we say like, you go to jail. You don't complain when the police come and grab that person because you say, oh, that's a legitimate government. And that does strike me as kind of a different thing than what Facebook is doing.
I think the thing that just really quickly, I think the thing that I took issue with what you're saying is that you said you kept referring to like the oversight board as if it was part of Facebook when it has been. I really do think it is pretty independent right now from Facebook, and I don't know if that's going to remain so. But like, I actually think that every single one of these people that they have gotten to do this is like determined not to turn into shills for Facebook, and like. There is no desire to do anything other than kind of hold to hold themselves to this mandate that they have been given.
Right. Although does anything stop Facebook from just saying, nah, when the oversight board says be like, we abolish you, right? Or we ignore you.
No, they can't abolish them.
It's a formal legal entity, but they can be like, that was very nice, carry on, and just ignore it.
But like, why, what kind of message would that send if they spend 2 years and $130 million, and which is not chump change, and basically found 20 like really, really well positioned people to write them smart opinions, and they did that, and then they said fuck you, and just paid no attention to it. I just think that is like a death knell for like, not that they could do much worse reputationally, but I mean, I just think that like that would be terrible. And I mean, yes, you're correct.
It'd be terrible for them business, right? Their business.
But you just said that the only thing that they cared about was business.
Right, but that's my point. Is that like usually when we talk about like, at least it seems when I talk about legitimacy, or like it would be like you carrying out there's a judgment against you and you have to pay it or else you are taken away, or being taken away and you don't resist them because you recognize they are the people that are allowed to take other people away. And this strikes me as, Facebook has set up this very independent, very judicially oriented body that they are free to ignore at any time. It has no power whatsoever, except to the extent Facebook thinks it's in its business interest to set up this thing and have it be independent and then to follow it because they've done it.
Which are two independent questions, actually, yes. Right? So the decision to set up this thing and fund it for 5 or 6 years or whatever has already been made. It is, in fact, independent. It will take whatever cases it wants and write whatever it wants. That die has been cast. The interesting question to me, that's an ongoing question, is, does Facebook see it as in its business interests to follow its rulings? And that is a matter of ongoing Facebook business interests. They've basically set up a court of laugh at us if we don't follow its instructions kind of power. But here's my question. I want to probe the putting on robes and grabbing a gavel and saying, now I'm a court thing.
I do too. I love this idea. It's great.
Because I think there may be more to it than you think there is.
Who's you? Me? Or
no, Orin. Like I actually think there are institutions that kind of function that way. And one of them is, most of them are losing power, but one of them is political parties, which kind of say, okay, we get to decide what conservatism is. And Liz Cheney, you're no longer part of the, goodbye. And they're kind of people who've just put on robes and grabbed gavels. And what works about it is that they control certain ballot access issues, but they're not really that much more formal than the oversight board is. It's just that there's a con game that people believe in. And those things have to start somewhere. So, in a way that's like, maybe we should have Scott Shapiro here, although he's bad for Yale and bad for America. I do think there's like, how do you get the con going? And I'm not sure that having Mark Zuckerberg say, okay, I recognize this con. These self-important people in robes are people who I take seriously as self-important people in robes. I mean, that's not like the worst way to establish authority that I've ever heard of.
I mean, I completely agree with that. This is kind of was a little bit my point before, which is that I think that like the Supreme Court, like the UN tribunals, like all of these things, they're only. I wrote in a chat today when I was doing an interview with a journalist that I was like, legitimacy equals impact of like a decision plus enough time in which people start to forget that this was used to not be a thing. Again, like I kind of think that that's exactly Ben's point, which is like everything is not a thing until it's a thing, and they've made this thing, and like you might mock it, but now it's going to start becoming a thing. What do you think?
Right. Orin? So I guess my question, Orin, is why are you confident that 10 years from now people will look at the oversight board's pretensions as essentially analogous to you putting on a robe, grabbing a gavel, and saying, "I'm the Supreme Court of my Twitter feed now"? Whereas,
why are you mocking my putting on a robe and saying I'm the Chief Justice of my Twitter feed? They might.
I'm not.
That's pretty important too.
I'm not. I think you're.
I can't believe you.
Why are you confident that will be the way people think of it, rather than like this was a claim of authority that Mark Zuckerberg acknowledged? Mark Zuckerberg brought Facebook with it, and his acknowledgement of it made it important, and therefore large numbers of people started submitting adjudications to it.
Right.
And just like if you say I'm the Chief Justice of my Twitter feed and large numbers of people start submitting disputes to you in that capacity.
Oh my God, don't give me that idea. I'm going to completely.
Like it becomes more limited than that, to be clear. Formal documents will follow explaining all this, but there
aren't that many disputes about your Twitter feed.
I'm not at all confident that this is the case. And in fact, you're talking to two professors, and if anybody knows how sort of these formal positions somehow in the perception of people convey some sort of authority, professors know that better than anybody else. Like the day you become a professor, they're like, the professor has entered the room, and you're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And the media.
Well, wait until
you're a professor. Can you
years old? And you
What's
actually look, I said, wait until you're 33 years old and you actually look exactly like your students. I'm sure you had the same experience.
I did. I was very happy that I turned 30 before I started teaching. So I'd be like, I'm in my 30s rather than like in my 20s. But so people start saying, oh, you're a professor. The professor has, I can't believe this professor has, and it's like, it's not like you know anything else just because you got this job. But it has all sorts of cultural associations and things that go along with it, and professors will often dress up in suits in class in order to convey a sense of professionalism, and so I get it that's how people will often get their perceptions of what is legitimate and who should be trusted and the like. I just think that it's in all of these contexts we should be poking fun at how that works and the arbitrariness of it. So that's
totally all. Buy it. So, and I'm all for poking fun at, particularly if you declare the charter as and start talking and this is where Kate's article is fabulous.
I will admit. Well, what fabulous? I thought you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, just no. Just everything you need to not buy Kate's view of the oversight board is right there in her article. Like she gives you all the reasons a reasonable person would have to take Orin's view of this. Because
it's like low-hanging fruit. Like there was nothing that I didn't hear. I took this show on the road as I did all of this research. I went and presented this fucking paper at like 18 different law schools, like all over the US, and then in 5 different, like in like Haifa and London and Germany. And like, anyways, like I really tried to like put it through the ringer as like an idea. And then at a certain point, just like legal research, like the points that people made started to repeat on themselves, and you kind of realize you're getting to the end. You're getting to like the end of like that. You're like, okay, I've got it all. Like I've captured all of the things that people are going to say about this, and it was like stress testing something.
So I have a question. What is the most, and let's leave religious examples out of this, because they, you could say like Moses or Jesus or, Brigham Young or John Smith or something. But those always beg faith questions, right? What is the most audacious example you can think of where somebody just put on a robe, grabbed a gavel, and said, okay, now I'm the court of blank, and people bought it? And now we have, like, there's no government power involved. There's just somebody self-declared, I have the right to adjudicate blank, and the world bought it.
The world bought it.
Can we think, or some segment of the world bought it?
Aren't all of them kind of audacious? Like
they are.
You land on some island. I declare this island for Spain. Like what?
No, I do this.
All these things. Yeah, go ahead, Kate. Take it away.
I'm sorry. But like I just like love this example because when I teach Johnson v. McIntosh in property class, do you remember Johnson v. McIntosh? That's the case where they're basically, someone has conveyed a huge segment of land to some people and they've taken it from native peoples, and the native peoples conveyed it to one group of people, and then it comes in and gets settled. And then the US comes in and decides that this is settled, and they have to decide between like the conveyance, whether the conveyance of native peoples to other people was valid. And they say, no, it was not, because you're not people. And and we discovered it first because we're discovering it. And there's this, I play this Eddie Izzard clip. That is Eddie Izzard, who's like she's like she is like walking across the stage, and she's just kind of like, she was like, we as the English settled all of this land with the cunning use of flags. Like we show up at a place and we say, this is our land, we're taking it. And it's 1 million people and they're all from India, and they say, no, this isn't your land, we're already here. Like, you can't take it. Like, well, do you have a flag? And like, I kind of think that this is, but the flag is the formalism. The flag is the robes. The flag is all of these things. And like, okay. I think that people do this all the time.
So let's exclude, for purposes of argument, religious claims and sovereign claims. So I want the example closest, that's not the oversight board, to Orin putting on a robe, grabbing a gavel, and saying, I'm the Supreme Court, I'm the Chief Justice of blank, and it catching on.
I was going to say Al Haig, maybe, but then the catching on part.
Yeah, it didn't work. Al Haig is a good example. For those who don't remember, when Reagan was shot, Al Haig was the Secretary of State at the time, and he barges into the White House press room and declares, quote, I'm in control here, which was, of course, false, because the Secretary of State is not actually under the presidential, under the 25th Amendment.
Tried to pull
the next one in line in succession. But he said it, and it, persuaded people for 30 seconds or something. And then Al Haig relatively quickly lost his job.
And now he's just known for that. That's the...
Yeah, that and being Nixon's chief of staff. Okay, so that's a good example. That one didn't work. But
I would try to, all of my mind is going to like ADR examples. But those are not widely acknowledged. I think people really have a hard time with them and see them as fundamentally unfair. I
have a great example, but it's in the adjudicative space, but it's a sovereign example, which is the Israeli Supreme Court declaring that it has jurisdiction over everything, and I mean that literally. The line
UCJ does this too.
The line from the Chief Justice Aharon Barak at the time is, quote, "Everything is justiciable," which strikes me as the appropriate level of audacious. And then also having original jurisdiction over everything. And so if you don't like anything in Israel, you can file a petition in the High Court of Justice, and they have a bit of a backlog, but they'll get to it eventually. And that strikes me as, I don't know of another example of that degree of judicial audaciousness in the world, actually. But it was an established court that did it. It's really Judge Orin declaring himself, having administrative review authority over everybody for everything. It's not Citizen Orin putting on the robe.
I don't know that there's been an example then. I don't think that, I think the other example would be UN tribunals. And I taught my last class of Cornell Tech, and I was teaching it, and I had this smart aleck kind of kid be like, "I just think this is all bullshit." He was prepping me for you, Orin. He was like, "This is just all crap. And I was like, "Man, do you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of what I said to Julie O'Sullivan when I was taking her international criminal court class at Georgetown. And I was like, this seems crazy to me. Why does anyone buy into this whole scheme? And now look at me go."
Ben, one example that does come to mind, this is going to be a terrible example, just preface it, but I was recently I was watching documentaries about English history in the 15th century and 14th century and 13th century and really sort of early medieval kind of stuff. And whenever there'd be a line of succession problem where it was not clear who was the next legitimate king, there'd be just sort of folks show up and be like, "I am the next king," and the other guy goes, "No, I am the next king," and then it's everyone's like, who's king? And then it would be they would go to the treasury and they would grab the gold, and then it'd be aha, the one with the gold must be the next king. And so it's this weird combination of a religious sense of what the order of succession was going to be and who had the actual power, and or just random coincidence, or that the person was 14 and they were too young, but this person was 19 and they were just the right age. I mean, I think a lot of it, that's just how the world works.
But they had syphilis. Sorry.
Pick it up.
So I think it is a real challenge to the idea of taking it seriously that we cannot think of an example where that's a close cousin, non-sovereign, non-religious claim that works. I will give you one, but it's not an adjudicatory model. What is it?
Well, there's a bunch, but there's the Motion Pictures Association.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yes. So there are some that are the Motion Pictures Association or the press councils in the UK that existed for a while. But none of these, but these are all the weird thing about this body is that it is both censor and a check on the censor. So right now it is primarily functioning as a check on the censor to put stuff back up.
But prior
it also
to 1969, there was a 3-second rule, and if the kiss went on for longer than 3 seconds, you couldn't show your movie.
Exactly.
And how about U.S. News for law schools?
Ooh, that's a really interesting, because that does have an adjudicatory.
Bob Morris typically runs American legal education.
They even have rules of evidence.
And so the U.S. News and World Report, now they the reason it has influence is that students have decided that they're legitimate. And so people pay attention to it.
But that's an exact analog.
But
they say, we are going to do this. People are like, well, okay, there's US News rankings now. And everybody starts behaving this way as though they are entitled to be the judge. It's the only thing that US News does that anybody pays attention to.
right.
Well, now, but it started out with like having the valence of being US News and World Reports, which was fairly serious. But like Rebecca McKinnon, who wrote Consent of the Networked, who is like one of like the kind of the formative like voices in this space, although not a lawyer, so like slightly different kind of valence to how she, or maybe she's a lawyer. I don't think she is though. And she doesn't like, she started ranking digital rights, which was basically supposed to be like a Reddit for all of the different platforms. And it is still going on. It still happens, but it has never had popular buy-up for some reason. But it is a great idea. And it basically rates how great these platforms are by their human rights, like kind of like how they adhere to human rights and how they recognize human rights, and ranks them. And like but this is not that at all.
But that's really interesting because it suggests like anybody can put themselves up as the arbiter of something. That's what half of journalists do. And certainly, you know, I do a fair bit of that. Hey, so-and-so said that this is in my area. I declare it bullshit, right? That's half of the blogosphere. The interesting thing about the example of US News is that it radically affects law school behavior and radically affects student behavior to the point that when people say, I want to go to a top 10 law school, they don't even refer to US News anymore. It just is a top 10 law school, right? And the referent is implied. So maybe there is a factor that, you know, like maybe the real step is not declaring yourself, not putting on robes and grabbing the gavel, but it's other people starting to acknowledge it, and that it's the acceptance by a community that they will be governed by you rather than the assertion of it that's interesting.
I don't want to like, I think that what was interesting to me about the decision was that I am friends with Jameel Jaffer. I count them as friends, Jameel Jaffer and Daphne Keller. And I'm trying to think of some others, but there were like a whole bunch of people that actually kind of updated their priors after reading the opinion that were like, oh, this is actually a really good, thoughtful kind of like opinion. And like, and Jameel had been deep. He wrote an entire New York Times op-ed, like slamming the board as a waste of time, basically. and you know, and he and I get along. It's fine. It's like, I don't have like an emotional investment in this board. It's just that I find it intellectually fascinating as like an exercise to watch institution building happening in real time, and like feel like there is like a role I can play as like an academic to document the processes that happen if they ever repeat themselves again in history. If this fails, fine, like whatever. It's good to have all of this written down and someone to have watched it and to know what happened.
So who, over what time frame, Orin, like what would have to happen for you to say, actually, I underestimated this project. It actually is playing the role that US News is, or like whatever role it's playing, whether they call themselves a court or not, you know, whether Noah Feldman has delusions of grandeur or not, they're actually playing an important, significant role. It's actually an institution that's worth giving serious thought to. What would have to happen? What would you have to see in order for you to come to that conclusion?
I guess the thing that I would look out for is people referring to decisions of the Facebook Oversight Board as having in some way settled something other than a business thing for Facebook. You know,
what about like, would it be international if international law tribunals cited to it? Would you take it seriously? I mean, I actually say this kind of always having had a skeptical eye towards international law. So,
yeah, I don't know if international tribunal citing something is my test for whether it's taken seriously.
Same.
But no, I mean, I guess if people, if if there's a question like, should this receive strict scrutiny? What's the right answer for that? And if people are like, well, if you've read the work of the Facebook Oversight Board, they held this, and so, and if everyone starts doing that, then it'd be like, okay, I was wrong. People apparently take that pretty seriously. Now, I do think that if Jamal Green or Michael McConnell writes a law review article, or if the two of them got together and wrote a law review article saying, we have reached the following conclusion about First Amendment law, and I think within our circle of law professors, that would be like, that's pretty significant. And
it's a weird pairing, yo. Like they are certainly an interesting pairing.
And they're they're powerhouse academics, and so I take what they say seriously. Whether they're writing for some oversight board or just with their own names. But I think it'd be something like that where people kind of start talking about, like, did you see what the oversight board did? And the oversight board had a really interesting judgment about this question.
So it has to break through outside of Facebook's business interests and dispute resolution within the Facebook world and become a reference point somewhere else for something else that they're working on.
I think that's right. And then I would be like, why are people taking this as seriously? But I would recognize that they are, which I guess is
that's actually a super useful and interesting test. Do you buy that as the test of when you get to say to the skeptics, see, I was onto something here? Or do you have a different test that you would, at which point you would say, hey, this has worked or not worked?
No, I think that's a fine test. I don't really think that there's going to be a moment in which is, okay, so like, listen, I feel like my short career in legal academia, it has been fraught with people telling me that I'm doing the wrong thing all the time and like wasting my time on certain types of topics. And like, I nonetheless have like kind of decided that I'm going to like follow certain areas. And I think that the world is on the brink of a very new type of understanding of public and private distinctions and of public and private adjudicatory models and that are not ADR. And because I would also say one thing about this, the oversight board is it does not forbear you from having any type of claim in any type of like court in your nation. If you have a claim in your nation, there's no exclusionary kind of idea here. So I just kind of think that this is like about shaping a new world that is going to answer for a transnational presence that is omnipotent and omniscient in the way that like Facebook and all of these other, and Google and all of these other these platforms are. And so like, for me, it is like a kitchen sink argument. Like you got to try everything. And so like, this was one thing to try, and it could have like, I had a solid, I will tell you why I was so excited last week. It is because I solidly thought that this decision was going to disappoint me in a huge way. I thought that they were going to just phone in some type of yes, Trump, no Trump type of substantive decision and skip over kind of like really hard structural procedural issues, and they didn't.
It excited you for precisely the reason it annoyed Orin, which is that they remanded it to Facebook for additional rulemaking.
Not inconsistent with this opinion.
Yeah.
Well, I think that they're framing up a Chevron case, Orin. Like, I think that they're literally framing up a Chevron case. I think that that's like that's kind of they're ready to
when
like
does
have,
the in
to
oversight
like defer to
Chevron,
agency deference. Yeah,
in oversight board Chevron 1, if the Facebook rule is clear and it does not conflict with Facebook values, you apply it. But if it's not clear, then you defer to the agency to Facebook on its interpretation. What does a Facebook oversight board Chevron look like?
I mean, it basically looks like the Chevron test is like a reasonableness test. And then I don't know, it's kind of arbitrary. Chevron is bullshit too. That's not but my point is that they could make a decision between whether they're going to pass the buck or they're going to basically really hold their feet to the fire in terms of international human rights law standards. And you heard Nate Persley the other day say that he thinks it's the wrong standards to hold things to at a substantive level. But I guess for me, I just get, listen, I don't know what Orin's life is like, but I get 25 emails a day from people who have been banned from Facebook or Twitter in some capacity and find my articles and find my email.
And they're like, she can help.
Yes. And the thing that I hear the thing that I hear from when I hear that is these people are tortured. They're looking for an answer.
I got a prominent former in lieu of fun guest out of Twitter jail the other day.
I know.
Not say who it was. It was
you won't say it was Scott Shapiro. No,
it was not Scott Shapiro. Scott Shapiro, to my knowledge, I think we would know if Scott were in Twitter jail because he would stop tweeting for a short period of time.
Can I say just two quick thoughts, which is one, Kate, and I should say none of the views I have in any way question. I think your scholarship is fantastic and super interesting, and I've read all of it, and I think it's great. And I think I agree with you that this is a model for how to do content moderation, which at some point was going to be tried, and we'll see how it works. And so I think we're going to have this sort of problem for the future, and so this is a really interesting experiment in it. And so I think the experience of I talked to a lot of junior scholars, especially who say folks are saying they don't think my scholarship is going anywhere, or it's not in there. And I think I don't know of somebody who, when they were a junior scholar, did not have senior people just be like, this whole research project is dumb. you
no.
do any of this. You should do what I do. And everyone has had that experience. So I ignore them. It would be my advice on that. But I do think also that I spent a lot of time. I used to moderate Volokh conspiracy comment threads, and that included deleting individual comments and banning commenters. And the experience of banning commenters was always interesting because 80% of the time they would, first of all, they'd say, you're only banning me because you don't like my message of whatever. And I had no idea what their message even was. But there'd be a First Amendment discrimination claim. And then they'd want due process. There should be a hearing. There should be a jury trial.
I remember your favorite commenter.
Anonymous.
No, wasn't it Mitch?
Oh, well, there was Mitch, who the fraud guy. Yeah.
Fraud.
Anonymous was the one who took hours and hours of my life for a long time. But yeah, so people are really invested in this, and I get it's important. So I think the model is really interesting. It strikes me as it's not ultimately a government. That's kind of my take.
No, it's not. It's not a government. It certainly is not. And I will shout out to Anupam Chandra's amazing piece of Facebookistan. Which analyzes the ways in which we understand a government to be a government and why Facebook is not a government. But just because you're not a government doesn't mean that you can't be doing things that look like a government and are governing. And certainly, I think that there might be space for a new model besides government, private corporations, and individual citizens. And I think that maybe some of these sites, the speech sites, are starting to bridge that. But Richard, so nice to see you, friend. I know.
Hello.
Hold on. You're unmuted.
Hello. I'm unmuted.
Go ahead.
So I guess listening to all these discussions about public and private, I'm wondering how much of this discussion actually turns on the ways that these terms are understood. I mean, usually certainly in the U.S., we understand public as pertaining to places where the state is involved, and private as, you know, the opposite of that, where the state doesn't have much influence or power, or, you know, is limited. And I guess I oppose that. Or the other conception I would think of is where the public, where the private actually belongs to the world of, you know, for example, domesticity and so on and so forth, and this real split between that, where, and as opposed to the public is not just things that are government, but anything that's like that's out there when people, you know, people are interacting in this way that is, you know, the opposite of that private, like, domestic sphere. And I'm just wondering how much is it, does that make any sense at all? Or
So I'll take, I agree with, I think the words public and private just have so many different meanings in so many different contexts.
I completely agree with that.
That yeah, it's always important when you're using those terms to define exactly what you mean by that. I think a lot of confusion can be avoided by being more specific. So agreed that those terms can be a lot of different things.
I wonder if there's use, and like you would find it like I wonder if courts would find it helpful too for someone to articulate levels of public and private. So I was thinking, for example, the private of privately messaging someone on Facebook versus being in a group, like a closed group on Facebook, and thinking that was private, and then being in an open group on Facebook and thinking that there was some kind of privacy by obscurity through that type of, like, through how you participate in that, versus posting something on your own timeline, for example. And I just really wonder, well, I mean, it depends on who you think of as exactly as you said, as like how we define public, but like the first two, like the last two, would definitely be public because they could be seen by anyone technically. The latter would kind of pass like a reasonable expectation of privacy test in terms of third-party doctrine, which is that you're using a third-party messenger service to send your messages. I don't know. I just think that there needs to be a lot more nuance ascribed to this. Mike Godwin, though, has the final question. Hi, Mike. It's so nice to see you.
Hi, it's nice to be seen. I hate those invisible times, but I'm here today. So, so I have I actually have like two questions, but I'm gonna try to be brief since we're at the end of the day. The two questions are really. You know, one of the things that every tribunal that anybody sets up for any reason has to go through this process of establishing its credibility and some kind of general buy-in. And one of the things that I've been writing about for the last couple of years, last 3 or 4 years actually, has been about what the companies could do to restore some faith in what their rules are. And my solution, which may or may not be good, was to look at the history of legal ethics and look at the history of medical ethics, because there was a period in Western culture where those were not formalized. I mean, there were treatises about them, but there was no shared understanding of what ethical practice was. I mean, people knew who was ethical and who wasn't. Maybe they did, but you didn't have grounds for complaint necessarily. And this is not the least of the reasons people distrusted lawyers, and still do. But with Facebook, I'm as skeptical of Facebook's oversight board as anybody, but there has to be, I want to just underscore what Kate said, which is that Facebook, by committing to this process, has maybe painted itself into a corner. You know, they can't sort of say, oh, well, this was a failure, we're not going to obey the rules. That seems to me like a foundational moment. And I also think back to the U.S. court system, where Marbury versus Madison and these other cases where you have the occasional president say, let them enforce it. You know, why do we even believe the Supreme Court could enforce anything? It's, you have to sort of buy into that. But my question really is, have you thought about how in non-legal contexts, the creation of these norms actually seems to work? And the two examples that come to mind are Wikipedia's arbitration committee, where they actually resolve disputes among editors
That's
about
a really interesting example.
editor behavior. And they actually, and they're not run by the Wikimedia Foundation. They were initially appointed by Jimmy Wales, but now they're elected by the body of editors, and they write opinions, and they refer to earlier opinions when they write new opinions. So it's
do they wear robes?
They didn't. Well, you can't really see them. They're doing a lot by email, so I don't know, whether what they're wearing, or for that matter, what they're not wearing. So
I want Zoom to create like robe filters so we can all just wear robes all the time.
The interesting thing about the ARBCOM, as the arbitration committee is sometimes called, is that it actually does seem to have earned trust in the general community that there's a process by which bad editor behavior can be disputed or adjudicated. And the other example just came to mind, besides lawyers, which are, where we write our own rules and then pretend to abide by them, is baseball. I mean, why do, when you play stickball in the street, you don't have an ump, you don't have an umpire, but you do have like these shared understandings with other players. But, for baseball to be credible as a sport that people invest in and pay to see, you need something like umpires or something like referees. And even though you may dispute particular decisions, you have to believe in the institution. And it seems to me that Facebook is trying to do something like that. To create something that's independent of the players, independent of the team owners, that is a referee or an umpire. And if that's what they're doing, then Facebook's refusal to go beyond, to do what Facebook wants them to do, which is write their rules for them. And instead to say, look, you have a policy in place, and then for other things, you don't have a policy in place, and we're not going to tell you what the policy is that you haven't written yet. That seems to me to be sort of almost Marbury versus Madison-like. You can't, we're not going to have original jurisdiction over some set of issues that you want us to have it over. And I just sort of wanted Orin's comment on that, because I think we have lots of examples in the non-legal world of people creating tribunals and adjudicatory bodies that have credibility without robes.
Yeah,
I think we absolutely. I think it's actually the most common way that people form clubs, and then there's like a board of the club, and there are elections for the club, and then you'll have a subcommittee of the club, and you'll have we do these sort of quasi-government like structures for like every association, non-corporate association that we do. This is like super common, I think. What's different I took to be about what Facebook's trying to do is that they're looking for credibility outside of Facebook. And I think there's a big difference between like we're in a club, we all like to crochet or something like that. So we have the Crochet Association, and we have the president of the club for 2 years, and then if somebody breaks the rules, we have the subcommittee and we may recognize that as members of the crochet club, but like does my neighbor I've never crocheted.
Well, I'm not a professional baseball fan, but I actually do believe that umpires are authorities. I mean, I actually do believe in the institution of umpires for baseball, which I've played, but which I don't watch.
So what I think that Mike is saying is that basically, like when you're playing stickball in an alley, like everyone is kind of like, oh no, everyone is the umpire. Like the crowd is like everyone playing is the umpire. The group is the umpire. They're like, oh no, you fucker, get back to first base. You didn't that wasn't a tag or like whatever, right? And I get that. I completely agree. And but what the canonization of baseball is, what the formalization of baseball is, requires actual professional umpires to be judging the various moves, because there has to be some type of intermediary to call those things, because it cannot be like a ad hoc decision, because there are things rating on it like money and franchises and World Series titles, right? And so I get that, and I see what you're saying, Mike, and I think that's a really great analogy, actually.
But I also think Orin's point that if you want it to, like you're asking something else of it, if you're asking it to have credibility and stature outside of the world of the baseball game. I mean, nobody except John Roberts looks at the baseball umpire and says, there's a source of law.
There's a source of neutrality.
Source of right. And so I do think you can both be right, that there's a utility to the private adjudication mechanism that Facebook is setting up, and it's super pretentious to call it a court and think that it's going to be a source of law in international, legal conversations. And I think I do think the test that Orin proposes, which is, okay, if this does more than functions as a private adjudicatory mechanism and is basically more than ADR, we'll start seeing it being, perform.
I love that.
It's a really interesting test.
I think it's a good test. I also think that, ironically, that Jamal Green, who used to write for Sports Illustrated, and is one of the authors of, and who is just a tremendous writer, and who is one of the authors of obviously one of the members of the oversight board. I don't know. I think he would like this analogy to like baseball. I think it's a fair analogy. There is something to be said for the civilization of baseball. It's a very, I don't know if anyone's ever watched the Ken Burns documentary. I used to be a huge baseball nerd, deep baseball nerd, and wrote a column about baseball for years before I kind of gave it up. And but there is the civilization of baseball is a real thing, and it has a lot of. I love that analogy, Mike. So thank you so much for giving that to us, and also for reminding us about the wiki adjudicatory model, which is great to remember. We have to wrap it up, but Orin Kerr, it was so great to have you. I'm sorry I had to really level your entire argument and leave you on the floor bleeding and gasping for breath. I know.
I appreciate. I've always had a great time, and it's always wonderful seeing the two of you. And so, thanks for including me.
Yeah.
Well, Orin, you're a great American, and you were the 7th guest, I believe, 6th guest on In Lieu of Fun.
You were always up for good fun. We are very well aware of that.
And you were the first guest on Pugilism Week, with Scott. Yeah. So come back and spar with us again soon.
Sounds good.
Kate, who's joining us tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we are so lucky to have Sarah Bond back with us again to talk about
fingers and toes.
Fingers and toes. So specifically to tell us the tale, basically, of the finding of one doctoral student's finding of a giant toe in the Louvre and realizing it was actually Constantine's finger on a giant metal sculpture. That is a fascinating story, and we will be back tomorrow to tell it. So until then, we don't have fun anymore, Ben.
Wait. That'll be 22 hours and 53 minutes from now.
Yeah, okay,
you
sorry.
Fucked it up, Kate. Until then.
We don't have fun anymore, but we can count on me not being able to
do the outro.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow, folks.
Bye.